The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole palace had taken one sharp breath and forgotten how to let it out. Daniel Hart was on his knees in the nursery, stacking soft blocks for the fourth time that hour, when the lights along the coral walls snapped from warm gold to a pulsing red, and every door in the corridor outside sealed itself with a heavy metal groan. He did not wait to find out why. He swept two of the children into his arms before the second block tower even finished falling, and shouted for the other two to grab his jacket and hold on tight. Sithra grabbed first, her small claws digging through the fabric into his skin, and he barely felt it. Ithra was slower, rubbing sleep from her eyes, so he pulled her against his chest with his free arm and started moving toward the reinforced feeding chamber at the back of the nursery, the only room with a door that locked from the inside. Behind him, the nursery attendant screamed a name that was not his, then screamed his name instead, then stopped screaming altogether as the outer door of the nursery buckled inward under something heavy hitting it from the other side. Daniel did not look back to see what happened to her. He had exactly one job in that moment, and it was not bravery, it was arithmetic. 4 children, 2 arms, 1 door he could still reach in time. He got all 4 of them through the inner door and threw the bolt across just as the outer door gave way with a screech of tearing metal. Something large moved in the smoke beyond it, low to the ground, fast. He put his back against the inner door, pressed the children behind him into the corner where the wall met the floor, and told them, in the calmest voice he could find, to stay down and stay quiet, and that nothing was going to reach them. He did not know if that was true. He said it anyway because 4 pairs of eyes were watching his face to decide whether the world was ending, and he had learned a long time ago, in places far worse than this palace, that children read your face before they read the danger. 3 floors above him, Queen Veyren was already moving. She had been in the middle of a trade council when the alarm cut through the chamber, and she did not stop to hear the rest of the minister's sentence. She was out of her chair and through the side corridor before her personal guard had finished forming up around her, moving faster than a matriarch of her rank was supposed to move in front of foreign delegates, and she did not care. Somewhere below her, in the nursery she had walked through every single evening for 3 cycles, something had broken in. Her advisor, Kale, caught up to her at the first junction, breathing hard, a data slate still gripped in one clawed hand. He did not waste time asking her to slow down. He simply matched her pace and gave her what he had. The breach was not random, he told her. The intruders had come through the old service tunnel beneath the eastern garden, a route that had been sealed off in the palace records for 11 cycles, which meant whoever planned this had access to records that no longer officially existed. That kind of access did not belong to outsiders. It belonged to someone inside the palace walls. Veyren did not slow down, but something in her chest went very cold and very still, the way the sea goes still right before a wave breaks. Down in the feeding chamber, Daniel could hear them working on the door, not smashing it, which would have been loud and clumsy and almost comforting in its stupidity, cutting it, in a slow, patient rhythm that told him whoever was out there had done this kind of thing before and was in no particular hurry, because they believed there was nowhere left for him to run. He looked around the small room for anything that could buy time. A stack of feeding trays, a water pitcher, a shelf bolted to the wall that held nothing more dangerous than folded blankets. He was a soldier once, a corporal who had carried a rifle through 2 campaigns before the coalition decided his temperament suited diplomacy better than combat, and every instinct from those years was screaming at him that he had no weapon, no exit, and 4 small lives depending on him finding one anyway. He found something better than a weapon. He found 4 children who trusted him completely, and that trust was, in its own strange way, a kind of leverage. He pulled Mia close and asked her quietly whether the feeding chamber had another way out, the way older children sometimes know about hidden paths that adults forget to ask about. Mia blinked at him, startled to be asked something important instead of being told to hide, and then she nodded slowly and pointed at the wall behind the shelf of blankets. There was a narrow drainage grate down there, she said, one the nursery staff used to flush the feeding troughs, and she and Sithra had once tried to crawl through it before getting caught. It was not much. It might not even fit a grown man, but it was a direction, and a direction was worth more right now than a locked door. Daniel pulled the shelf away from the wall, ripped the blankets off, and found the grate exactly where Mia said it would be, rusted at the edges, barely wide enough for a child. He knelt in front of it and looked at the cutting light already starting to glow orange along the seam of the inner door, and made the fastest decision of his life. He would not fit through that grate, but the children would. He told them, as steadily as he could manage, that they were going to crawl through the tunnel one at a time, that Sithra would go first because she was fastest, and that they were to keep moving no matter what they heard behind them until they reached the garden pool where the water ran warm, and that he would be right behind them the whole way. That last part was a lie, and he knew it the moment he said it, and he said it anyway, because sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is lie to a child for exactly as long as it takes to save her life. One by one he pushed them through the narrow gap, Sithra first, snarling defiance even as she went, refusing to let go of his sleeve until the very last second. Then Ithra, crying quietly but moving fast. Then Corin, silent and focused, the calmest of the four, who paused halfway through just long enough to look back and ask if Daniel was coming too. He told her yes. He was already planning how he would slow the intruders down long enough for that to become true. Mia went last, and just before she disappeared into the dark of the tunnel, she reached back and grabbed his hand, and said one word that had nearly gotten him removed from the diplomatic post 3 cycles ago, and which he had never once corrected, and which he would carry into whatever came next like armor. She called him Dad and told him to hurry. The inner door failed 30 seconds later. 2 figures came through the gap in dark tactical wear, moving low and fast, weapons already up, and Daniel had nothing but a water pitcher and his own body between them, and a drainage grate too small for him to escape through. So he did the only thing left to do. He threw the pitcher at the first one's visor, hard enough to crack the faceplate, and grabbed the second one around the middle before it could bring its weapon to bear, driving them both backward into the ruined doorframe. It was not a fair fight. He knew that going in. He was one unarmed man against professionals with training and equipment, and the only advantage he had was that they clearly wanted him alive for questioning rather than dead on the floor, which was the only reason the first shock strike only stunned him instead of killing him outright. He went down hard, ears ringing, vision swimming, and through the haze he heard one of the intruders shout that the children were gone, that there was a tunnel, and heard the other one curse and start dragging him upright by the collar instead of finishing him off, because a hostage was still useful even if the real prize had slipped away. That was when the door at the far end of the corridor blew inward, and Queen Veyren came through it at the head of 6 armed guards, moving with a speed and a fury that made the intruders freeze for the exact half-second they needed to freeze for everything to go wrong for them. She did not order her guards forward first. She went first herself, claws extended, and the intruder holding Daniel by the collar barely got a shot off before she was on him, and the shot went wide into the wall instead of into anyone who mattered. The second intruder tried to run for the tunnel the children had used, realized halfway there that his shoulders would never fit, and turned back around just in time to be brought down by 2 of the guards. In less than a minute, it was over. Daniel was sitting against the wall with his head still ringing, one intruder unconscious at Veyren's feet, the other zip-tied and furious, and the queen of the deep coral spires was kneeling in front of him with an expression on her face that he had never seen there before, something raw and unguarded that no amount of court training had prepared her to hide. She asked him where the children were, and her voice cracked slightly in the middle of the question, which for a woman who had ruled without visible weakness for 140 cycles was its own kind of small earthquake. He told her about the grate, the tunnel, the garden pool, and she was moving again before he finished the sentence. Guards fanning out ahead of her toward the eastern garden, and Daniel pulled himself up off the floor and followed, because lying still while those 4 children were alone in a drainage tunnel was simply not something his body was willing to do, concussion or not. They found all 4 of them exactly where he had told them to go, huddled together in the shallow, warm water of the garden pool, soaked and shivering and very much alive. Sithra saw her mother first and let out a sound that was half relief and half fury, the sound of someone who had been terrified and was only now allowing herself to feel it. Veyren scooped up as many of them as her arms could hold, and for a long moment nobody in that garden moved or spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that the sight of them together did not already say. It was Corin who broke the silence, tugging at her mother's sleeve, asking in a small voice whether Dad was okay, because he had been bleeding from the head when they left him behind. Veyren looked up and found Daniel standing at the edge of the pool, soaked to the knees from wading in after them, blood drying along his temple, swaying slightly on his feet but upright. And in front of 6 guards, 2 captured intruders, and every gardener and staff member who had come running at the sound of the alarm, the 9th matriarch of the Vey hatchery throne did something no one in that palace had ever seen her do before. She said thank you, in the parental tongue, the language reserved for family and not for foreign guests, and the weight of that word landing in front of witnesses meant something no formal ceremony ever could. The investigation that followed moved fast, because Veyren wanted it too. The intruders talked, eventually, once they understood exactly how little patience the Queen had left for people who had put a blade to a door behind which her daughters were hiding. What they revealed confirmed what Cale had suspected in that first frantic hallway conversation. The service tunnel access, the timing of the breach during the Trade Council when the Queen would be occupied, the specific targeting of the nursery rather than any other part of the palace. All of it pointed to someone inside the walls who understood the palace's oldest secrets, and who had a very specific reason to want the situation resolved before the nomming of an honorary human clutch father could be formalized in front of the full court. The trail led to a senior member of the traditionalist faction, a counselor named Doran Vel, who had spent the last several 10 days quietly arguing in closed sessions that a foreign human sitting on the Regency Council would weaken the throne standing among the other great houses. When argument failed to stop the ceremony from moving forward, he had decided to remove the argument's inconvenient center instead, believing that if Daniel disappeared quietly enough, the children's attachment would fade the way childhood attachments were supposed to fade, and the whole embarrassing chapter could be written out of the palace records. He had badly misjudged both the children and the Queen. Vel was arrested in his own chambers 2 days later, and the news moved through the palace faster than the alarm had, faster even than the story of the rescue itself, because nothing travels through a court like the fall of someone who thought himself untouchable. The remaining traditionalists, watching one of their most senior voices dragged out in restraints, found their objections growing considerably quieter. Daniel spent that night in the palace infirmary, more out of insistence from the medical staff than any real necessity, and woke to find all 4 children asleep around his bed in various uncomfortable positions, having refused to be moved back to the nursery, no matter how many attendants tried. Sithra was curled against his hip with one hand still fisted in his blanket, the same grip she had used on his sleeve since the day they met. Mia had claimed the foot of the bed entirely. Corin and Ithra had pushed 2 chairs together and fallen asleep leaning on each other. Veyren found them like that when she came to check on him before the morning session, and stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. The same way she had stood frozen in a nursery doorway 3 cycles earlier, except this time there was nothing uncertain in her expression at all. She told him quietly that the formal ceremony would proceed as planned, and that after everything that had happened, no one left in that court had the appetite to object, and that whatever title the writ gave him on paper, it would never come close to describing what he had actually done for her family. He told her, with the particular exhausted honesty of a man who had nearly died the day before, that he had not thought about titles or writs or politics at all in that feeding chamber. He had thought about which child was fastest, which one needed to go first, and how to make a lie sound true for exactly as long as 4 children needed to believe it. She said that was precisely the point. A crown could be inherited, a council seat could be granted by decree, but the thing her daughters called him, the thing that had frozen the entire palace the first time anyone heard it, could not be given by any ceremony at all. It could only be earned, one ordinary day at a time, until the day it was tested and it did not break. The formal ceremony took place a 10-day later, in front of a full court that had, for once, nothing left to argue about. Daniel stood beside the throne in a uniform that had finally been properly pressed, with a healing scar along his temple that the children insisted made him look like a hero from one of their stories. And when Cale read the old line about staying when the water rose, all 4 of them said it back in unison before he had even finished the sentence, exactly as they had the first time, except this time their voices did not waver at all. The Osek ambassador, watching from the visitors' gallery, did not frown this time. He simply made a note on his data slate and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. A story about a foreign human word breaking 100 cycles of tradition had, in the space of 10 days, become a story about a man who had crawled through fire and steel to save the 4 small lives that word belonged to, and no amount of court politics could argue with that kind of proof. That evening, after the guests had gone and the corridors had quieted, Veyren found Daniel in the nursery garden exactly where she always found him, sitting on the low stone wall with 4 children arranged around him in various states of exhaustion from a day of ceremony and celebration. Sithra was already half asleep against his shoulder. Mia was recounting the rescue for what had to be the 10th time, embellishing the drainage tunnel a little more with each telling, and nobody bothered to correct her, because some stories deserve to grow a little in the retelling. Veyren sat down on the other end of the wall, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, watching the light fade over the coral spires, listening to 4 small voices arguing sleepily about whose turn it was for the next story. She told him, eventually, that she had ruled for 140 cycles, and had faced down war councils and border skirmishes and enough political intrigue to fill 100 archives, and that none of it had ever frightened her the way those 10 minutes in the corridor had frightened her, not knowing whether her daughters were safe. He told her he understood that feeling exactly, because he had lived inside it for every second between pushing the last child through that grate and hearing her voice come through the ruined doorway. She looked at him for a long moment, then looked at her daughters, all 4 finally drifting off to sleep in a pile against his side, the way they had slept that very first evening she had watched him from the doorway and not known what to do with what she was feeling. She said that whatever the writ called him on paper, and whatever the council chose to call him in their formal records, she had stopped thinking of him as a foreign liaison a long time ago. Somewhere between the 10th day he showed up without being asked, and the day he crawled through smoke and steel rather than let go of her children. He did not need a grand title for what he already knew he was. He was simply Dad, and the palace, for the first time since that word had first frozen every corridor in the building, finally felt completely at peace with it.